When a racist CEO questions a black woman's credentials, he has no idea she's a trauma surgeon. But when disaster strikes mid-flight, what she does next will make you question everything. Stay tuned to see the shocking outcome. At Chicago O'Hare International Airport, Dr. Maya Carter, a 34-year-old trauma surgeon with an air of quiet confidence. Maya had spent the past 48 hours in the ER, stitching wounds, setting bones, and, in one case, saving the life of a man who had been brought in without a pulse. This flight to Dallas was her first break in weeks. As she boarded the plane, she adjusted her simple navy blazer and settled into her first-class seat. For Maya, flying first class wasn't about luxury. It was a rare indulgence she allowed herself after years of working 16-hour shifts and skipping meals. But she was well aware of the stares that followed her. A young black woman in first class always seemed to draw attention. It didn't bother her anymore. At least that's what she told herself. As she placed her laptop bag under the seat, her gaze shifted to the man walking down the aisle. He was tall, mid-50s, with a crisp gray suit and a Bluetooth earpiece. His expression screamed entitlement. He looked at his boarding pass, then at her, and his lips pressed into a thin line. This was the kind of man Maya had encountered her whole life. Dismissive, quick to judge, and always assuming the worst. The man stopped beside her seat. "You're in my spot," he said flatly, gesturing toward the seat number. Maya raised an eyebrow, double-checking her ticket. "Actually, this is 4A. Your seat is across the aisle in 4B. His face flushed slightly, but instead of apologizing, he huffed, "Fine. First class just isn't what it used to be." He shoved his briefcase into the overhead compartment, nearly knocking down her bag in the process. Maya bit her tongue, reminding herself that she was here to relax, not argue with strangers. The man sat down heavily in 4B, glancing at her every so often with a look of thinly veiled disdain. She knew the type. He was someone who would assume she was in this seat by accident, or worse, by charity. Maya took a deep breath, determined to ignore him. As the flight prepared for takeoff, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming everyone and outlining the journey to Dallas. Maya leaned back in her seat, ready to close her eyes and steal a few minutes of peace. But her neighbor had other plans. "So, what do you do?" the man asked, his tone sharp and intrusive. "You don't look like the usual crowd up here." Maya opened her eyes and turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. "I'm a trauma surgeon," she said simply. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Really? A trauma surgeon? That's interesting." Maya didn't take the bait. "Yes, it keeps me busy." He leaned back, smirking. "Well, I'm Greg Stanton, CEO of Stanton Holdings. We specialize in infrastructure development, real work." The way he said real made her skin crawl. Maya gave him a polite nod and turned her attention to the book she had pulled out of her bag. But Greg wasn't done. "You must have had some help to get where you are," he continued. "Affirmative action, maybe." Maya felt a flicker of anger but refused to give him the reaction he wanted. "No," she said calmly. "Just a lot of hard work and determination." The man scoffed, muttering something under his breath. Maya clenched her jaw but reminded herself to stay professional. Men like Greg didn't deserve her energy. About 45 minutes into the flight, the cabin was quiet. Some passengers were dozing off while others flipped through magazines or watched in-flight movies. Maya had just started to relax when a commotion broke out near the front of the cabin. A man in his early 60s had collapsed in the aisle, clutching his chest. The flight attendants rushed to his side, their faces pale with panic. "Is there a doctor on board?" one of them called out, her voice trembling. Maya was on her feet before she even realized it. "I'm a doctor," she said, moving quickly toward the man. The passengers in the cabin turned to watch, their eyes wide with fear. Greg Stanton, still seated, looked stunned. "You're a doctor?" he muttered, as if the very idea defied logic. Ignoring him, Maya knelt beside the man, quickly assessing the situation. His breathing was shallow, his skin clammy, and his pulse weak. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. The man's eyes fluttered open briefly before closing again. "We need the emergency medical kit and an AED," Maya said to the flight attendant. "And if there's aspirin on board, bring that too." Passengers murmured anxiously as the flight attendants scrambled to comply. Maya worked swiftly, her hands steady as she adjusted the man's position and prepared to administer aid. She could feel the weight of everyone's gaze, but she tuned it out, focusing solely on the task at hand. In the background, Greg watched in silence, his earlier smugness replaced with a mixture of disbelief and shame. The flight attendant returned with the kit, and Maya began working to stabilize the man. Time seemed to slow as she monitored his vitals and administered oxygen. She knew they had only minutes to prevent the situation from spiraling further. By the time the man's condition had stabilized, the cabin was silent, except for the hum of the engines. Maya stood up, her back aching and her adrenaline still pumping. The passengers erupted into applause, but Maya barely noticed. She returned to her seat, exhausted but relieved. Greg didn't say a word as she sat down. For the first time in the flight, he seemed to have nothing to say. The cabin had settled into an uneasy quiet. The man Maya had just saved was now resting in the care of a flight attendant, who was monitoring his condition until they landed. Passengers were still exchanging murmurs about what had just happened, but the air carried a new kind of energy, one of awe and respect. Maya sank back into her seat, her body still tense from the adrenaline. Her fingers tapped absent-mindedly on the armrest as she replayed the event in her head. She wasn't looking for thanks, but she could feel the weight of someone's gaze. She turned slightly and met Greg's eyes. For a moment, he didn't speak. His face was flushed, but not from anger this time. It was as if he were struggling to piece together the words he wanted to say. Finally, he cleared his throat, sitting up straighter in his seat. "You saved that man's life," Greg said, his voice quieter than before. It wasn't a question. It was a statement laced with disbelief. "Yes," Maya replied simply. She wasn't in the mood for small talk, but there was something different in his tone now, something less abrasive. Greg leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low. "I made assumptions about you earlier. That was wrong of me." Maya looked at him, her expression neutral but firm. "You didn't just make assumptions," she said. "You dismissed me. You judged me without knowing anything about me. And the truth is, people like me deal with that every day." Greg winced at her words, the reality of his actions hitting him harder than he'd expected. "You're right," he admitted after a moment. "I shouldn't have said the things I did. Watching you back there," he trailed off, shaking his head. "I've never seen anything like it. You were calm, focused. You didn't hesitate." "That's my job," Maya said evenly. "I've trained my whole life to handle emergencies like that. And believe it or not, I'm not the exception. There are plenty of black women, and people of color, who excel in fields like mine. We just don't always get the recognition." Greg looked down at his hands, clearly grappling with her words. "I guess I've spent too much time in my own bubble," he said finally. "I've been in business for decades, and I've worked hard to get where I am, but I see now that I've overlooked a lot, ignored a lot." Maya didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them, giving him a moment to sit with his discomfort. Finally, she said, "It's not enough to realize it. You have to do something about it. Change the way you think, the way you treat people. And maybe next time, you'll catch yourself before making those assumptions." Greg nodded slowly, his face serious. "You're right," he said. "I have a lot to work on. And I'm sorry for how I treated you earlier. It wasn't fair." Maya offered him a small, tired smile. "Apology accepted. But remember, this isn't about me. It's about understanding why you thought that way in the first place." The rest of the flight passed in relative silence. Greg didn't say much after their conversation, but Maya could tell he was deep in thought. Occasionally she caught him glancing at her, his expression unreadable, as if he were trying to process everything he'd just witnessed. When the plane finally touched down in Dallas, the cabin erupted in applause once again, this time for the successful landing and the sense of relief that filled the air. As passengers began to gather their belongings, Greg hesitated before standing. He turned to Maya one last time. "Dr. Carter," he said, his voice softer than before. "Thank you, not just for saving that man's life, but for opening my eyes. I won't forget this. Maya nodded, her expression kind but firm. I hope you don't. As she stepped off the plane, Maya was greeted by the humid Texas air and the sound of people moving about the terminal. The weight of the flight, the assumptions, the confrontation, the emergency, had been exhausting, but she felt a quiet sense of pride, not just for what she'd done, but for how she'd handled herself. She didn't need anyone's validation. She'd proven her worth long before this flight. But if she'd managed to change one person's perspective, if Greg Stanton thought twice the next time he encountered someone like her, then maybe the experience had been worth it. And as Maya walked through the terminal, her stethoscope tucked safely in her bag, she allowed herself to smile. She hadn't just saved a life that day. She'd planted a seed of change. And for her, that was just as important.